I'm Stuart Ralston. I'm a rheumatologist from the University of Edinburgh, although I have a special interest in bone disease in general and osteogenesis imperfecta in particular. Some disclosures as shown there. I'm going to be talking about a trial called the TOPaZ Trial mainly, but a little bit about other trials. First of all, obviously the audience knows all about osteogenesis imperfecta. It's an inherited disease. It's pretty rare. It's usually caused by what we call pathogenic variants in one of two genes, COL1A1 or COL1A2. And those genes code for what's called collagen, which is the main protein in bone. Collagen is in other tissues, not just bone, but bone is a target, as it were, for the complications in OI. And a key feature, not the only feature, are fractures, broken bones throughout life. And I'm showing here a slide from Lars Folkestad. It was a study in Denmark. And what he did was he compared the number of fractures in people with OI with the rest of the population. And the OI is the dotted line on the top, and the rest of the population is the solid line on the bottom. And what you can see is that in OI, there's hugely more fractures. They actually peak in childhood, and then they go down in adulthood. Now, it's been known for decades that this decrease happens anyway, even without treatment. So if you look back at Colin Patterson's data, going back to the 60s, fracture rate decreases in OI, which is great, and it's thought that that is due to the skeleton growing and the bone getting stronger. Okay. And there have been trials in OI before, but well, to be quite honest, they've not been very good. Okay. They have been too small, and the investigators have primarily looked at what's called bone density by DEXA, and Rachel touched on DEXA. And the assumption was, well, if we get an effect on bone density by DEXA, that could be good, that could indicate benefit. But in fact, and they've used what's called repurposed drugs for osteoporosis. And many of you will have heard of bisphosphonates like zoledronic acid, pamidronate, and those have been used in OI. The difficulty is, if you just do bone density, in OI, because the collagen isn't quite right, the bone quality and strength is reduced, and it's not clear if having a bigger bone density is beneficial in preventing fractures. Okay, so that's the kind of starting point. And that is why there are no approved drug treatments for OI to this date. No one has looked at fractures, and the regulatory agencies like the FDA, the EMEA, the MHRA, they want some kind of hard endpoint. You know, they want something like benefit in fractures. That's not the only thing you could look at. It could be benefit in quality of life. But the issue is they've just looked at things like markers and BMD. Okay. Now, about 10 years ago, Jannie Hald, who's one of my colleagues from Denmark, and I did what's called a meta-analysis of clinical trials in OI. And this is where you scrunch together all the data from trials and you look if there's a benefit. And the vertical line means there's no change. And overall, the bottom line was this, is the trials that had been done with bisphosphonates had not shown a reduction in fractures. You may find that incredible, since bisphosphonates are used still and have been used for decades, but they do not seem to prevent fractures convincingly. Now, that has led both pharma companies and people like myself to look at other drugs. And I'll show you one drug which was of interest, and this was studied by a researcher called Eric Orwell. The paper was published in 2014. And I'm showing you a data slide from this. So people were randomized to what's called teriparatide, and that's a drug that builds up new bone. What we call, our boneheads call it an anabolic drug. It will actually build new bone. And the participants got randomized to teriparatide, that's the solid line, or a placebo, a dummy treatment. Well, it wasn't just a dummy treatment. They all got calcium and vitamin D, actually. And what you can see is there was a much better increase in bone density with teriparatide than placebo. Although, again, this was really too small to be informative, only 30 versus 29. There wasn't a difference in fractures, but we didn't expect that because the study was small. But this study had led myself and others to think, well, maybe we should investigate this teriparatide. It looks kind of quite interesting, and that's what we did in the TOPaZ study. So this is not long finished and not long published. The inclusion criteria were people aged 18 plus with a diagnosis of OI. They needed to consent, And the only real contraindications were if there was what we call a contraindication to one of the drugs. In other words, you couldn't give it for one reason or another, or if they were pregnant. There were virtually no other what we call exclusion criteria. And the treatments were self-injections of teriparatide. The drug is given by a pen every day for 2 years, and then an infusion of zoledronic acid. That's the same treatment that is used in kids and adults with OI. Standard care, people could use a lot of things. They could use bisphosphonates, they could use calcium and vitamin D, they could not give a bone-targeted treatment. And the study was specifically designed to reduce fractures, okay? So we had enough. Trialists would talk about power, and that means if there was a reduction in fractures, we would have seen it, okay? When you're doing trials, there are things called endpoints, so that's the things you look at. And what we called the primary endpoint was the number of people who had a new fracture confirmed by X-ray. And then we had a lot of other what we call secondary. We had spine fractures, total fractures, fractures reported by participants, whether or not it was confirmed. We looked at bone density and quality of life and side effects. So here's the timeline of TOPaZ. It's been a life's work. Started in 2017. Initially, recruitment was very slow. That's because we were asking the centres in the study if they would fund the teriparatide. They refused to do so. That was a disappointment. I was at the verge of suicide here. But then Eli Lilly donated teriparatide free of charge, and things zoomed up. We thought, fantastic. And then COVID hit. That was a killer. Things flatlined for 2 years, but then gradually recruitment picked up, and we recruited to our target of 350. So that's the biggest ever trial of any kind in osteogenesis imperfecta for a rare disease. And then we finished the trial in February 25. And as I say, we've just got the study published. It was a multi-center trial, lots of different hospitals. Very happy to have Rachel on board in Dublin, amongst 3 other European countries, Amsterdam, Paris, and Aarhus in Denmark. So that was the recruitment. This is how it looked. We call this the disposition. So in the centres, there were 793 people on their books, but not everyone wanted to take part. 274 declined, 112 never answered the letter, 40 didn't meet the criteria. Eventually, we consented 361. 11 kind of couldn't be entered because of one reason or another. 350 randomized, 176 to teriparatide, zoledronic, that's TPTDZA, and 173 to standard care. And we had 150 completed the final study visit. Now, I'm showing here what the characteristics of patients were. So they were about early 40s, slightly more women than men, 54% women. It was mostly what they call type 1, Silence type 1 OI, so that's the kind of milder form of OI. Let's see, about a third had dental problems, 2/3 had a bone deformity of some kind. The baseline characteristic, a bit more, they were mostly variants in COL1A, 1 and 2, so that's what we expected. The bone density was variable. The average was what's called osteopenia. Okay, so it's a kind of slight reduction in bone density, but not to the extent of having what we call osteoporosis. Nearly 50% had previously had a fracture in the prior 2 years. More than 50% had a spine fracture at the very start. And about 27-28% had been treated with bisphosphonates in the previous 2 years. Actually, 70% had received a bisphosphonate ever during their life. So most people had been treated with a bisphosphonate. So the first result is the bone density result. And we saw this, we're quite pleased. So teriparatide in ZA is in blue, and standard care is in green. And what we find is teriparatide between years 0 and 2, and bone density spine increased like quite a lot with teriparatide, pretty decent. And then after we gave zoledronic acid, it increased even more. It actually doubled by the end of the study. Standard care increased a bit, but not really as much as the active treatment group. And total hip, not much at 2 years. That's kind of what you expect with teriparatide. It's better at the spine than hip. But again, zoledronic acid consolidated that increase. So we had a very robust increase in bone density. We thought, wow, this is going to do something. But then when we looked at the effect on fractures, there was nothing. There was no effect on fractures whatsoever. So participants with fractures, 36% in each group. Spine fractures, 66 versus 61. That's new fractures. Total instant fractures, 191 with teriparatide versus 146 with standard care. So actually, there was more fractures in the teriparatide zoledronic acid group. And the participant fractures, almost exactly the same. And the number of participant fractures, no difference. So we had to think about this and thought, well, sometimes you get results you're not expecting. But there we go. That's research. That's why you do research. And in fact, when I was asking patients to take part in the trial, they were saying, well, what if I get randomized to the standard care? And I told participants, well, look, if I knew that this treatment was going to work, we wouldn't be doing a trial. The reason we're doing a trial is we don't know it's effective. And we persuaded 350 people to take part. So this is just, they call this technically a Kaplan-Meier plot, where you plot the number of fractures with time, and there was no difference. And just skip through this. The other thing we did is we thought, well, is there a subtype of OI? Do men respond differently from women? What if the bone density is lower or higher? And we looked at all of those things, and there was nothing. Okay, so there wasn't a subgroup that responded better than others. There was a couple of things that came out of interest, and I'll just show you one slide. And one of the things that people with OI I know complain of is pain and a reduction in quality of life. And we saw an effect here, which is quite interesting. So this is pain, and it's called BPI interference. So the question is, how much does the pain interfere with your quality of life? And what we found was the teriparatide was definitely different from the standard care, okay? Higher scores are more pain. So teriparatide, they were experiencing less pain or less interference, which is quite interesting. And then this score is called EQ5D, Eurocall 5D. It's like a score of quality of life. And again, teriparatide was looking better. It wasn't so impressive as the BPI, but it was looking better. And so that seemed a benefit. And then I spoke to, when I showed Debbie, our research nurse, this, she said, well, that's interesting, because she was seeing the patients at the visits, and she said it's funny because the participants who were on the injections were kind of feeling better somehow. So I think that's an interesting thing. We were talking earlier, though, at the table about so-called placebo responses, and whether having an injection, you think, well, something's happening, I'm doing something, and that makes you feel better. So, but anyway, something for discussion. So in summary of TOPaZ, this treatment, which really increased BMD, did not reduce fractures. We couldn't identify a subgroup that benefited. And my take on this is we need to move on from bone density drugs, because this was just quite clearly hopeless for fractures. So we need something else to look at fractures. But the quality of life is interesting, and I think it would be, if I was a bit younger, I might be thinking of a trial looking at teriparatide and pain. I would say that would have to be a dummy trial. So you'd have to have the real injections, and you'd have to have a pen with dummy injections to bottom out if it was really effective. Actually, after we got our results, this study was spoken about, or this press release was made with this company Ultragenyx and Mario. And they had studied what's called setrusumab, which is a bone anabolic drug in OI. They did 2 studies. One was called Cosmic, and one was called, what's the other one, Orbit. And they had very good increases in bone density with this medicine, but no benefit in fractures. So it made me realize this is real. This is real. Now, I want to end on a bit of a positive note, because you could look at this in a kind of negative way and said, oh my God, what are we going to do now? But I think it helps us to focus ideas on, I think we need to move on to new options. There is a trial in progress inhibiting 2 proteins called DKK1 and sclerostin, and they're high in people with OI, and it's thought that they may impact on the bone and make it not so strong. And there's a company called Angitia who have this drug called AGA-2115, and they're just about to start investigating it. It's not a huge study, but there's something in the pipeline. There's another approach that could be used in OI because it's a genetic disorder. And there's a couple of genetic diseases where drugs or medicines that reverse an abnormality in a molecular process called splicing. Don't want to go into detail, but it reverses this process. And splicing is abnormal in a lot of people with OI. And there's a medicine called Spinraza, which has been shown to be effective in a disease called spinal muscular atrophy, and it works in the same way. And there's another one in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it's a splicing drug. It's called Exondys, and that works. And both of those drugs are licensed, and they're effective. And there's no reason why this couldn't be done in OI, but I don't know if anyone's looking at that. There's another final thing that fascinated me. I was at the European Calcified Tissue Conference in Spain, and I saw this presentation using what's called GLP-2 and GIP agonists. Now you've all heard of Wegovy and stuff like that. These agonists are in the same ballpark as these weight loss drugs. But incredibly, there are agonists of these two proteins that improve bone quality and improve bone strength. And the investigators studied them in a disease model of OI and found even without changing bone density, they actually improved the strength of bone. And I found that very exciting. So there we go. That's the update in clinical trials. I'll just wind up by thanking all the participants in TOPaZ, people that took part, because otherwise we wouldn't have had this very important result. All the investigators, research staff, the Brittle Bone Society, who were partners with the study, really helped us a lot, and the OIFE, who also helped us a lot publicizing it. The NIHR for funding, and Eli Lilly. And I think I'll be taking questions at the end, but there we go. Thank you, Patricia.